When I stepped outside, I was met with pure chaos. A bulldozer halfway through our driveway, the tunnel roof caved in, sirens screaming in the distance, and my grandmother in tears. And the HOA president? She just stood there, calmly sipping iced tea like she'd ordered a pizza, not a full-blown demolition. What she didn't realize was that the tunnel she just destroyed, it was built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in 1952. And now, congratulations, Karen, you've officially committed a federal crime. Let me rewind this circus of absurdity, because I know exactly what you're thinking. Wait, what? How is that even legal? And how did she not notice? Trust me, I've been asking myself the same questions ever since. Cedar Hollow Estates was renowned for its immaculate lawns, pristine sidewalks, and a community where every detail was carefully controlled by the local HOA. It was a place where conformity was the rule and individuality was quietly stifled under a veneer of order. At the helm of this regimented world was Karen Mitchell, known by everyone in the neighborhood as HOA Karen. With her signature iced tea in hand and a clipboard that she carried as though it were a scepter, Karen was the embodiment of the HOA's uncompromising standards. I grew up on the outskirts of Cedar Hollow in a sprawling property known as Miller's Bend, a farm that had been in my family for generations. Our homestead was a patchwork of fields, orchards, and hidden gems. But the crown jewel of our estate was a secret tunnel running beneath the property, a tunnel built in the early 1950s by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Originally constructed as part of an emergency communications network during the Cold War, the tunnel had been long forgotten by most. For my family, it was our secret passage, a relic of history that connected our barn to a nearby wooded area. We used it for everything from storing heirloom produce to evading harsh weather, and it had become a cherished symbol of our resilience and resourcefulness. While most of Cedar Hollow Estates prized neatness and predictability, our little corner of the world at Miller's Bend was full of surprises. I always took pride in preserving our family legacy, from the old farmhouse to the underground tunnel that whispered secrets of the past. I'd even taken to restoring parts of it, ensuring that its historical integrity was maintained. The tunnel was not only a part of our heritage, it was a lifeline that reminded us of the ingenuity and hard work of our forebears. Then came the fateful day when the HOA, under the directive of Karen Mitchell, decided to improve the neighborhood. Karen, in her infinite zeal to enforce uniformity, had targeted our property for what she termed unauthorized alterations. Without even consulting me or verifying any details, she ordered the demolition crew to tear down what she believed was an eyesore, the tunnel that had served as a proud secret of our family for decades. The news of the demolition spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had admired the mystique of Miller's Bend were now outraged that such a vital part of local history had been reduced to rubble. For me, the tunnel was a priceless legacy, a piece of history that no bureaucrat had the right to erase. And as I stood there, in disbelief at the sight of twisted metal and shattered stone where our tunnel had once run, I knew that this was a violation that could not go unanswered. The chaos was evident from the moment I arrived home that afternoon. My phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from outraged neighbors and frantic calls from family members. I rushed to the site, where the demolition crew was still working, and my heart sank as I saw the remnants of what had once been a sturdy, secret tunnel. Large chunks of concrete lay scattered on the lawn, and what used to be a quiet passage was now nothing more than a pile of rubble. I immediately confronted the demolition crew, demanding to know who had ordered the work. Their answers were vague, something about a request from the HOA. It didn't take long before I discovered that Karen Mitchell had taken it upon herself to enforce what she considered to be community standards, without even bothering to check the historical significance or legal status of the structure. Furious, I gathered all the evidence I could, photos of the rubble, security camera footage from the day before showing Karen directing the crew, and historical documents proving that the tunnel was built by the Army Corps of Engineers in 1952. I knew that this wasn't just a personal loss. It was a symbol of my family's legacy and a piece of national history, obliterated by one overzealous enforcer's ignorance. I began compiling a digital dossier, posting my evidence on community forums and local social media groups. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbors who had long felt oppressed by the HOA's arbitrary rules flooded in with support, sharing their own stories of overreach and calling for accountability. Hashtags like hashtag Save Our Tunnel and hashtag Karen Must Pay began trending in our small town. But the more the community rallied, the more Karen dug in her heels. In a series of stern messages and emails, she defended her actions, insisting that the tunnel was a hazard and that its demolition was necessary for the community's safety and aesthetic standards. Her tone was icy and dismissive, as though our shared history and the evidence I presented were mere inconveniences in her quest for order. Karen's refusal to acknowledge the historical significance of the tunnel struck a deep nerve. It wasn't just about property rights. It was about preserving a legacy that had been part of our family for generations. I realized that if I were to stand any chance of reclaiming justice, I needed to take more decisive action. With my digital dossier as my shield, I decided to take the fight directly to the HOA board. I sent them a formal complaint, complete with all the evidence of Karen's missteps, and demanded that the board rescind any fines imposed on my family and launch an investigation into the demolition. I also reached out to local historians and even contacted the Army Corps of Engineers, hoping to verify that the tunnel was indeed a protected historical structure. Their response confirmed my worst fears. The tunnel was a registered historic asset, and its demolition was not only illegal, but a federal offense. Armed with this incontrovertible proof, I organized a town hall meeting at our community center. Flyers were distributed, and soon, a diverse crowd of residents gathered, united by their shared frustration with the HOA's draconian practices. I took the stage and presented my evidence, explaining in detail how Karen's unilateral decision had not only erased a piece of our collective history, but had also violated federal law. The meeting erupted in applause and shouts of solidarity. For the first time, the community truly understood the magnitude of what had been lost, and the lengths we were willing to go to set things right. As the meeting ended, the energy in the room was palpable. It was clear that our community was no longer willing to accept arbitrary fines and unilateral decisions. My call for action had sparked a movement demanding accountability, transparency, and a reevaluation of the HOA's power. Karen's actions had inadvertently united us against a common enemy, the overreach of bureaucratic control. In the days that followed, online petitions soared, and digital evidence of the demolition was shared far and wide. The pressure on the HOA board mounted, and whispers of legal action began to circulate. I could sense that the wheels of change were beginning to turn, and that our community was on the brink of a watershed moment. The battle for our history, our rights, and our collective memory had only just begun. In the wake of the demolition, Cedar Hollow was transformed into a battleground of ideas and emotions. Social media exploded with a mix of outrage, disbelief, and calls for justice. Hashtags like hashtag Save Our Tunnel, hashtag Karen Must Pay, and hashtag Heritage Under Fire trended locally, as residents shared photos of the rubble and the security footage that clearly implicated HOA Karen in the demolition. Digital petitions demanding an investigation into the destruction of the historic tunnel quickly amassed thousands of signatures, and local news outlets ran continuous segments on the controversy. I received a steady stream of messages from neighbors, some who had always secretly admired our family's historical asset, and others who had experienced similar abuses of power by the HOA. The support was overwhelming. At community forums, residents shared their own stories of being fined for minor infractions, and many expressed a growing determination to stand up against the arbitrary enforcement of outdated rules. The digital dossier I had compiled became a symbol of our collective resistance, a powerful testament to the fact that our heritage could not be erased by a single, overzealous individual. Meanwhile, the HOA board, once a monolithic body of unquestioned authority, began to fracture under the weight of public pressure. Emergency meetings were convened, and leaked minutes revealed deep divisions among board members. Some argued that Karen's actions were necessary to maintain safety and order in the community, while others acknowledged that the destruction of a federally recognized historic structure was a grave mistake that could not be ignored. The internal discord only fueled the public outcry, as residents demanded that the board take decisive action and hold Karen accountable for her blatant disregard of our shared history. Determined to push the issue further, I reached out to local historians and legal experts, who confirmed that the tunnel was indeed a protected asset, a relic of Cold War ingenuity that belonged not just to my family, but to the community and the nation. This validation of my claims only intensified the calls for justice. I organized a series of community meetings and public demonstrations, where residents gathered to protest the HOA's failure to protect our cultural heritage. Banners reading "Heritage Matters" and "Justice for our tunnel" were carried in the streets, and the collective energy was palpable. One particularly charged evening, as a bitter wind swept through Cedar Hollow, I found myself in a heated discussion with a longtime resident who had once been a staunch supporter of the HOA's strict policies. "This isn't just about a tunnel," he argued, his voice trembling with emotion. "It's about our right to preserve our history and our identity. We can't let someone like Karen decide what belongs in our community." His words struck a chord, and soon, more and more residents echoed his sentiment. The situation reached a boiling point when the local government announced that it had launched an official investigation into the demolition. The investigation, bolstered by my digital evidence and the overwhelming community support, threatened to expose not only Karen's misdeeds, but also systemic failures within the HOA. Public forums lit up with discussions about the need for reform, and legal experts weighed in on the potential for federal charges, a prospect that sent ripples of fear through the ranks of the HOA board. Amid this escalating tension, I continued to document every development. I posted updates on social media, shared video testimonials from outraged neighbors, and even held a live stream from my property where I walked through the rubble of the destroyed tunnel, explaining its historical significance and what its loss meant to our community. Each post, each video, further mobilized the residents, uniting us in a common cause. The digital momentum grew so strong that even local news channels began to feature my story as a beacon of grassroots resistance against arbitrary authority. Interviews with community leaders and affected residents painted a vivid picture of a neighborhood rising up to reclaim its rights and preserve its heritage. It was no longer just my fight. It had become a community-wide movement, and every shared piece of evidence reinforced the demand that the HOA board take responsibility for the destruction of our historic tunnel. As the final public hearing approached, the pressure on the HOA board was immense. The final digital petition had gathered tens of thousands of signatures, and every resident in Cedar Hollow seemed ready to take a stand. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown, a moment when the board would be forced to choose between defending an overzealous enforcer or embracing a future where heritage, history, and individual rights were respected above all else. The decisive moment arrived on a cool, crisp morning at the Cedar Hollow Community Center, where the final public hearing was convened. The boardroom was packed with HOA officials, local government representatives, community leaders, and hundreds of impassioned residents, all gathered to witness the moment that would determine the future of our community's governance. With a calm, yet commanding presence, Councilwoman Elaine Foster stepped up to the podium, her eyes burning with the collective resolve of a community that had been pushed to its limit. After an exhaustive review of all available evidence, including time-stamped security footage, detailed photographic documentation, and the heartfelt testimonies of our residents, we have reached an inescapable conclusion. Councilwoman Foster began, her voice strong and unwavering. It is abundantly clear that the demolition of the private tunnel on Miller's Bend, built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in 1952, was not the result of an accidental oversight or a necessary safety measure, but rather a flagrant act of vandalism driven by personal bias and a gross abuse of power by Mrs. Karen Mitchell. Her words echoed throughout the room, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Councilwoman Foster continued. Effective immediately, the HOA board will rescind all sanctions and fines imposed in connection with this incident, and we will initiate a full disciplinary review of the practices that allowed such an overreach. Furthermore, we will establish new guidelines to ensure that all historic structures and culturally significant assets within our community are protected by law. Today's decision is not simply about reversing an unjust demolition. It is a resounding declaration that our community will not stand idly by while our heritage is destroyed by unchecked authority. Murmurs of agreement spread through the assembly. At that moment, a well-respected community advocate, a man whose tireless work for local preservation had earned him widespread admiration, rose to speak. Today, we stand united in defense of our history and our rights, he declared, his voice imbued with passion. No resident should have their heritage erased by the whims of an overzealous enforcer. Let this vote be the turning point, a clear message that Cedar Hollow values our past and protects our future. We demand accountability, and we will not rest until every violation of our cultural and property rights is rectified. His words were met with thunderous applause, resonating deeply with everyone present. Following his address, a senior officer from the local historical preservation office presented the final dossier, a meticulously compiled record of all digital evidence, expert evaluations, and official documents verifying the tunnel's historical status. The evidence was irrefutable. The tunnel had been built in 1952 by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and was a registered historic asset. The Internal Affairs Panel unanimously endorsed strict disciplinary measures against those responsible for the demolition, and the full report was scheduled for immediate public release. Councilwoman Foster concluded, "Let this resolution mark the dawn of a new era for Cedar Hollow, a community where every resident's rights are respected and where our shared heritage is preserved with the utmost integrity. Our vote today is a resounding declaration that we will protect our history and our freedom from arbitrary interference. Together, we stand for justice, accountability, and the inalienable right to honor our past while building a better future." Her final words, delivered with unwavering conviction, sealed the turning point in our battle for preservation and property rights. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom shone with determination and hope, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The overwhelming digital evidence and the unified voice of the community had forced the HOA board to take decisive action, a turning point that would forever reshape the governance of Cedar Hollow. The days of unchecked authority and arbitrary demolitions were over, and a future built on respect for history and individual rights was finally within our grasp. In the weeks that followed the historic vote, Cedar Hollow underwent a profound transformation. News of the rescinded fines and sweeping reforms implemented by the HOA board spread rapidly through local media and on social networks, igniting impassioned discussions about heritage preservation, community governance, and the protection of private property rights. Editorials in the local newspaper, bearing headlines such as "A New Dawn for Cedar Hollow" and "Community United for Preservation," celebrated the decisive action taken to safeguard our cultural assets. Hashtags like #SaveOurHeritage, #NoMoreHOverreach, and #HistoryMatters trended widely, reinforcing our collective determination to stand up against arbitrary rule enforcement. Town hall meetings and community forums saw unprecedented attendance as residents gathered to share their own experiences and to envision a future where individual creativity and historical legacy were honored. Neighbors who had long lived in fear of invasive fines and capricious rule enforcement now spoke proudly about their right to preserve and celebrate their heritage. "Our history is the heartbeat of our community," one impassioned resident declared at a crowded meeting, his voice echoing across the room. The atmosphere was charged with hope, a promise that Cedar Hollow would always defend the rights of its residents and protect its shared cultural legacy. Within the reformed HOA board and local public agencies, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Susan Ramirez, launched comprehensive training programs focusing on ethical governance, historical preservation, and the responsible management of community resources. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary processes were established to ensure that every complaint would be scrutinized fairly and that no historic asset would ever again be jeopardized by personal vendettas. Our duty is to safeguard our community's heritage and the rights of every resident, Lieutenant Ramirez affirmed in a follow-up press conference, reinforcing our renewed commitment to justice and integrity. Community leaders and local civil rights organizations also mobilized to further empower residents. Workshops, public forums, and educational campaigns were organized to raise awareness about the importance of preserving historical landmarks and the value of individual property rights. When we come together, our voices can change the course of history. A local activist proclaimed at a town hall meeting, inspiring neighbors to unite and demand a more inclusive and respectful governance model. For me, the journey from confrontation to resolution was deeply personal and profoundly transformative. My decision to fight against the demolition of our private tunnel, one that held a century's worth of memories and historical significance, was not just about reclaiming my family's legacy, but about setting a precedent for future generations. The digital evidence that exposed HOA Karen's overreach became a beacon of hope and a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the right to preserve our heritage. Neighbors, once silenced by fear of punitive measures, now found their voices and shared their own stories of resistance, uniting in a collective call for justice. Karen Mitchell, once the feared enforcer of the HOA's draconian policies, was now reduced to a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that no one is above accountability when the community stands united. Digital records of her past transgressions circulated widely, underscoring the need for reform and the dangers of unchecked power. Her influence waned rapidly, and she became synonymous with the very overreach she had once championed. At a final celebratory event held in the Central Park of Cedar Hollow, residents, local officials, and community advocates gathered under the golden light of a setting sun. A large banner reading, "Unity, Freedom, and Heritage," was unfurled between majestic oaks, and heartfelt speeches echoed promises of a brighter, more inclusive future. Today, we celebrate the triumph of our collective spirit over arbitrary authority, Councilwoman Foster declared, her voice ringing with conviction. The standing ovation that followed was a powerful affirmation of our shared commitment to protecting our rights and preserving our history. As each new day dawned over Cedar Hollow, the legacy of that fateful confrontation endured as a beacon of transformative change. The story of how the HOA demolished our private tunnel, built by the Army Corps of Engineers in 1952, and the subsequent community uprising that forced accountability became a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the sanctity of heritage and individual rights. Every sunrise now carried with it the promise that in Cedar Hollow, truth, justice, and historical preservation would forever prevail. In the end, what began as a personal battle evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. We emerged more united, more vigilant, and more determined to safeguard our rights against any form of bureaucratic overreach. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it carried with it the promise that Cedar Hollow would forever be a place where creativity, integrity, and respect for our shared heritage shone as brightly as the morning light.